Last month, the EU announced that they would be financing Ukraine's war effort with €90 billion of joint debt. The mood music at the time was pretty miserable. After all, most of Ukraine's European allies were dismayed that they hadn't found a way to use Russia's frozen assets. But there's actually reason to think that this could be a fundamental, if underappreciated, turning point in the history of the EU. So, in this video, we're going to explain why, given a peace deal in Ukraine isn't forthcoming, the EU will probably issue more joint debt in the future, and how this might ultimately pave the way for a more federal EU. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So, let's start by explaining why a peace deal in Ukraine doesn't seem likely anytime soon. If you just glanced at the international headlines, you might assume a deal was essentially imminent. In his New Year address, for instance, Zelensky claimed that a peace deal with Russia was, quote, 90% ready. Only a couple of days earlier, Trump went further, insisting the two sides were, quote, 95% of the way there. It's also true that Ukraine has made some substantial concessions in recent months, including accepting that it won't be joining NATO, at least in the near future, and the creation of a free economic zone in the bits of Donbass that Ukraine still controls. Nonetheless, there is still a seemingly unbridgeable gulf between the Ukrainian and Russian positions, largely because Russia has, for the most part, continued to insist on its maximalist demands. In a speech made on December the 19th, for instance, Putin insisted that he was still sticking to the demands he made back in June 2024, which included Russia taking total control over Donbass, and Ukraine accepting its, quote, demilitarization and denazification. A non-exhaustive list of outstanding disagreements includes what happened to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is currently controlled by Russia, the size of Ukraine's standing army after the war, and the nature of any post-war security guarantees for Ukraine, with Russia ruling out the involvement of any NATO countries, including as part of some non-NATO coalition of the willing. It's also worth noting that Putin never actually endorsed Trump's original 28-point peace plan, which was widely condemned in Europe as being unfairly biased towards Russia. Rather, Putin only said that it could form the basis for future agreements, and suggested that there was still a lot more work to be done. This lukewarm reaction to the 28-point plan means Putin will almost definitely reject the 20-point plan that the US and Ukraine are currently ironing out, given it looks to be less pro-Russia than the original 28-point one. Nor does the mood music seem to be improving. If anything, the intensity of the war has escalated in recent weeks, and Russia said it would be toughening its negotiating position after accusing Ukraine of attacking Putin's residence with drones. Although we should say this probably didn't happen, given no proof has been provided yet, and the CIA has come out to say it doesn't think it happened. In short, despite Trump's best efforts, it's hard to see a viable middle ground at the moment, largely because Russia remains unwilling to make meaningful concessions. This takes us on to the second part of this video. This will probably require the EU to issue more joint debt. Ukraine is fast running out of money. Trump has withdrawn all US financial support, and the international bond markets are understandably hesitant about lending more. This means it's up to Ukraine's European allies to stump up the cash. Originally, the plan was to fund Ukraine by seizing the €210 billion of Russian assets held in Europe, which were frozen after Putin's full-scale invasion. As you might already know, however, that plan fell apart last month, largely because Belgium, which is where something like €190 billion of the assets are held, worried that seizing the assets could leave Belgium vulnerable to expensive legal challenges from Moscow in the future. In the end, the EU decided to fund Ukraine by issuing €90 billion of joint debt. That is, debt issued by the European Commission as opposed to member states. Now, €90 billion isn't a lot of money relative to the size of the European economy. It's only about 0.5% of the EU's overall GDP. However, it's worth noting that the rate at which the EU has been issuing joint debt has risen markedly in recent years. Before the pandemic, there was basically zero joint debt. The EU issued the occasional bond to finance specific lending programs for financially distressed countries, but the sums involved were minimal, and there was always a clear sense of how the money would be repaid. After the pandemic, however, this all changed. The EU massively increased its borrowing to fund two new instruments designed to help member states cope with COVID, the SURE and the Next Generation EU programs. The EU's joint debt burden duly surged from about 50 billion euros during the pandemic to about 400 billion euros by 2023. This was supposed to be a one-off, but the pandemic was quickly followed by Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The EU responded with Readiness 2030, formerly Rearm Europe, which offers an additional 150 billion euros in loans for joint European defence projects, and has now been followed with an additional 90 billion euros of joint borrowing to fund Ukraine, taking the EU's total joint debt burden to something like 1 trillion euros. And this number is likely to rise in the future, not just because that's the direction the various trend lines are heading in, but also because Ukraine will need more money, not just because no peace deal is forthcoming, but also because Ukraine will need extra money to stand a chance of forcing concessions out of Russia. And this takes us on to the third and final part of this video. If this happens, this would also fit a long-running historical pattern. Crisis forces some central authority to act as a borrower of last resort, and then the process of repaying those debts breeds deeper political union, because taxpayers want more influence in how their money is spent. This is what happened in America and Germany, both federal systems that evolved out of confederations of independent states. At America's founding in 1776, the federal government, then the Continental Congress, had no powers of taxation, and, like the EU today, relied entirely on contributions from member states. Americans didn't like the idea of a strong central government, but during the War of Independence, the Continental Congress had to step in as a borrower of last resort to fund the war effort, and then had to assume tax-raising powers to pay off these debts, paving the way for political union. Similarly, before the First World War, Germany was a patchwork of at least semi-independent states, and the Reich, essentially the federal government, had limited tax-raising powers, mostly involving tariffs. The First World War forced the Reich to step in as a borrower of last resort, and then assume the power of direct taxation in the interwar years. The sums involved in both the American and German experience were greater relative to GDP than the amount the EU has borrowed so far. The EU's joint debt burden only represents about 5% of the EU's total GDP, compared to 40% for the Continental Congress and 80% for the Reich. But the trend lines are headed in one direction. If you're interested in this, in the latest issue of our magazine, we talk to fellow creator Money and Macro to discuss how Europe can revive its economy, getting into how the continent can balance conflicting priorities, handle Trump, and deal with China's competitive threat. There's so much more in this issue too. In addition to our cover story about the new Middle East, there's also full sections dedicated to UK, EU and global news. The global section discusses why Trump's mandate isn't quite what it seems, how politicians conquered social media, as well as our rundown of the biggest elections that happened in 2025. Our UK section runs through the rise of the new left, why next year's elections are critical at all levels, as well as the strategies Starmer ought to take to maintain power, and Farage to gain power. As well as the interview, the EU section also includes Macron's fall from grace and how Albania has implemented an AI minister. Subscribers to Too Long automatically get 20% off every copy as long as they stay subscribed. But as a special end-of-the-year offer, you can get an additional 30% off your first issue if you use code December25 at checkout. Find out more by heading to toolong.news or by clicking the link in the description.